Okay. While Civil War generals, armies, and battles have been the subject of countless books, magazine articles, and films, the contributions of women in the conflict have been less noted. Women on both sides of the conflict supported their respective causes in ways great and small, from serving as nurses, spies, writers, in battle, in industry, or by simply keeping the home and farms running. For some, their war activities propelled them toward a new independent mindset and more active future roles, although it took a long time. Okay, today, historical reenactor Phyllis Chapman will present For the Cause, Women of the Civil War. She will appear as Dr. Mary Walker, Civil War surgeon, telling of her work and the contributions of other women during that bitter conflict. So, without further ado, I present Dr. Mary Walker.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, a lovely group we have here today, and pleased to be here. I am Dr. Mary Walker. That's right, doctor, a fully qualified physician, Syracuse Medical College class of 1855. And before we go any further, yes, I am wearing trousers. They are not men's clothes, they are my clothes, and I am a woman, a sensible woman. Of course, most people I know and work with think I'm some kind of a freak. But I have to say that, judging from the ladies in my audience today with respect to dress, it seems I've been right all along. But I was fortunate to have an unconventional upbringing. Now, our society told us that men are strong, woman is beautiful, man is bold and daring, woman diffident and unassuming. But my parents thought otherwise. They were farmers, but they didn't have any distinction between men's work and women's work in our home. I was the youngest of 7 children born to Alva and Vesta Walker on November 26, 1832, in central New York. As I said, our parents had a very egalitarian idea towards household work. Mother helped with the farm work, and father pitched in with the household chores. Neither of them put any of their daughters in those tight corsets and long skirts. So impractical and unhealthy. Now, Miss Catherine Beecher's book, The American Woman's Home, a treatise on domestic economy, extols woman as the goddess of the hearth. Included in her book are instructions for the goddess on how to get rid of bed bugs and build a privy. Oh, really? It took the strength and stamina of a Trojan just to get through the everyday household chores. Far from being the timid, weak, docile creatures described in our popular literature, we women were hardy, energetic, resourceful, and a lot smarter than some men wanted to admit. But we had to be. Here we are in 1861, and we found ourselves in the middle of a civil war that we had little or no part in making. But like our grandmothers and mothers before us, we put our hearts, heads, and hands into the job at hand, supporting our men, our families, and our country. For some of us, in surprising, dare I say, unwomanly ways. Well, high-flown patriotic ardor swept over us all at first and disappeared just about as quickly as it came. When it became evident early on in the war that it was not going to be over in a few weeks, we women took the initiative to find ways we could utilize our talents and perhaps seize a bit of opportunity of adventure in the war effort. Now, as a physician, I, of course, applied to the Army Medical Department for an appointment as an Army surgeon. I was rejected. Feeling stunned, but not surprised, For the Surgeon General replied to me that he had no idea that a woman would ever apply. I was told that I could offer my services as a nurse, but only named Araminta by her parents, Ben and Harriet Ross, she belonged to Edward Brodus of Bucktown, Maryland. She had seen 2 older sisters sold away south. She'd been hired out to other families at 5. Mistreatment was a way of life. As a teen, she was severely injured when an overseer threw a heavy lead weight at her, striking her in the head. She recovered, but suffered from narcolepsy or sleeping sickness and severe headaches for the rest of her life. In 1849, she escaped to freedom, traveling on foot alone. With the help of Underground Railroad conductors, she reached Philadelphia. A new, free life as Harriet was wonderful, but tenuous. The Fugitive Slave Law, passed in 1850, required that anyone, North or South, if they knew, had to return an escaped slave to their master or risk prosecution themselves. Slave catchers roamed northern cities and towns. And what about her family that she left behind? She became an intrepid conductor on the Underground Railroad. Over a 10-year period, Harriet liberated as many as 350 people, including her relatives and her own aged parents. She usually embarked on one rescue mission a year. She and her cargo traveled by night and slept by day in hostile territory. She liked winter expeditions because the days were shorter and the nights longer. She liked to leave on Saturday nights, since an overseer or a master wouldn't be able to report her missing until Monday morning. Adept at disguises, she navigated with natural phenomena. The moss grows on the north side of the tree trunks. She quieted babies with opium and urged frightened adults on at gunpoint if necessary, and she eluded capture. People, black and white, began to call her Moses. When war came, she attached herself to Massachusetts troops in Fort Monroe, Maryland, helping contraband, or escaped slaves, find provisions and work. The controversial Union General Benjamin Butler had initiated the policy of confiscating escaped slaves as property of people in rebellion against the government. Enslaved people nearby learned of this, and soon men, women, and children began emancipating themselves. Now, seeing her at work among the contraband in the camps, the military soon realized that her leadership abilities and her experience as a Underground Railroad conductor had prepared her for even more. So she made an excellent and efficient spy. They sent her to the Sea Islands off South Carolina in 1863, where she embarked upon her most daring rescue mission of all. She became the only woman to lead a military raid in the Civil War. On June 2nd, 1863, at 3 a.m. in the morning, she, on board with 3 ships that were loaded with 300 mostly black soldiers, sailed up the Combahee River in South Carolina, avoiding the sunken torpedoes placed there by the Confederates based on Harriet's previous reconnaissance. Now, once they had landed, the troops quickly dispersed the Confederate sentries nearby and then began laying waste to the area, burning the prestigious Middleton, Lowndes, and Hayward plantations, mills and outbuildings, and confiscating cash crops of rice and cotton. The enslaved nearby were very wary of the ships, but they soon learned that Lincoln's gunboats had come to set them free. Over 750 men, women, and children were liberated that night as Harriet led them to the boats. Harriet recalled the scene later. I never see such a sight. We laughed and laughed and laughed. Here you'd see a woman, pail on her head, young one hanging on behind. One woman brought 2 pigs, a white one and a black one. We brought them all on board, named the white pig Beauregard and the black one Jeff Davis. As she was helping the people on board the ship, Harriet stumbled over her skirt and vowed that she was going to ask her friends in Massachusetts to send her some bloomers, as she didn't intend to lead a military raid in skirts again. Haven't I been saying that about women's clothing? Well, I wanted to do my part, but in spite of numerous applications, I could not get an appointment anywhere as a military surgeon. I finally accepted a position as assistant surgeon, working with Dr. J.N. Green at the Indiana Hospital, which was located in the National Patent Office in Washington, D.C., as a volunteer. Dr. Green was in desperate need. His previous associate physician had literally been worked to death. While Americans could admire the British lady Florence Nightingale for her heroic work helping wounded and sick soldiers in the British Army in Crimea, Americans didn't want their wives and daughters doing such a thing, mixing with strange men from all walks of life, tending to men's bodies and bodily functions, young unmarried women wanting to serve, horrors. But of course, even after a little while, the military realized they were going to need women's help. Now, Miss Dorothea Dix, single, independent, financially secure, had already made a name for herself in our country by advocating for more humane treatment of the insane. She was appointed by the Union government to be superintendent of all nurses in Union Army hospitals. Now, her qualifications for nurses conformed to propriety. They had to be over 30, married, dress in plain black or brown with no hoops, and ideally be unattractive. Young women wanting to serve were heard bemoaning their good looks. Now, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, had been considered for, but not given Miss Dix's position. Male authorities could not tolerate the idea of a woman who believed herself to be and was, in fact, an equal. She instead turned her efforts to working in New York City, setting up a 3-month training session for Army nurses and working with the Women's Relief Association, which later morphed into the Sanitary Commission. It's been estimated that about 21,000 women served as nurses in Union hospitals during the war, and probably just about as many in the Confederacy. Now, black women served too. In the South, the enslaved were often hired out by their masters to serve as nurses, and then the masters pocketed any pay they made. Well, the names of most of these black nurses have been lost. A couple of exceptions are Anne Bradford Stokes, Alice Kennedy, Ellen Campbell, Betsy Young, and Sarah Kinno, nurses that were escaped slaves that worked on the hospital ship, the Red Rover, in the Mississippi River. But let me introduce you to some other women who served. Sophronia Buckland, a young independent seamstress from Auburn, New York, was one of the first nurses to sign up. Her service record reflects First Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. When Gettysburg took place, she was one of the first nurses on the scene and among the last to leave. This is Phoebe Pember from Georgia. She was appointed matron of Richmond, Virginia's massive Chimborazo Hospital that comprised 5 hospital divisions that estimated they cared for about 76,000 soldiers over the course of the war. Now, Phoebe was an able administrator, supervising nursing and diet, and keeping the keys to the whiskey cabinet. This is Mary Jane Safford from Vermont. She served under General Grant at the battles of Fort Donelson and Shiloh. After the war, she studied medicine herself and became one of the first female gynecologists in the country. Kate Cumming was from Alabama. She served in field hospitals in Alabama and Tennessee, and these hospitals moved quite frequently to stay close to the front. This is Dr. Esther Hill Hawks, who earned her medical degree in 1857. She was not allowed to enlist as a military surgeon, but her husband, also a doctor, was assigned to the contraband camp off the southern coast of South Carolina, so she went along. She ended up serving as physician to the U.S. 33rd Colored Troops and opened up a school for black children down there. Now, after the war, women who could provide proof of their service were granted pensions, though at a much reduced rate from soldiers. But after what they had seen and done, most of them could never go back to being those helpless females again. Not that they ever were, really. There were some ladies, however, who liked to use those antiquated notions of female delicacy to blind many an unsuspecting soul for devious ends, including spying. While I was working with Dr. Green in Washington, the city was abuzz with the news of Mrs. Rose Greenhow's arrest as a Confederate spy. This lady, popular Washington, D.C. socialite and hostess, had made no secret about her dislike of Lincoln and her support for secession. Yet plenty of Union generals and politicians continued to be dazzled by her at her soirees, never thinking that maybe they should hold their tongues. What use is a lady for politics anyway? Well, Mrs. Greenhow wrote a coded letter concerning Union intentions right before the first Battle of Bull Run. And she gave it to a 16-year-old friend named Betty Duval, who tied it up in her hair and then took it to General Beauregard. He later credited Mrs. Greenhow for his victory there. Well, she was interrogated by Lincoln's newly created Pinkerton detectives a month later, and she was placed under house arrest. In spite of almost daily interrogations, she continued to send messages to the South, either through visitors coming to see her or hand signals at her window. She would not be intimidated. She was finally sent with her young daughter in January 1862 to the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. She was released in May of that same year and sent south, where she remained until August 1863, when she sailed for Europe, purportedly carrying official papers from Jefferson Davis to the British government. Well, on her return home, her ship was sighted by a Union patrol ship, and she asked to be rowed ashore to avoid being captured. It was said she was wearing a money belt loaded with British gold when her boat capsized and she drowned. Her body was recovered and was buried with full military honors in the Confederacy. Well, Washington, D.C. may have had their rebel spy in Mrs. Greenhow, but the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia, had its own version in Miss Elizabeth Van Blue, another Southern lady who this time was a Union spy. Like Mrs. Greenhow, she used her good family name and high social standing to cover her activities on behalf of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army in Virginia. Well-to-do, living in a fine home with servants who were secretly free under her. She also cultivated a slightly odd persona, which led some of her neighbors to call her Crazy Bet behind her back. She didn't care. In fact, all the better. Now, she was an avowed Unionist, and she persuaded the warden of the military prison in Richmond to allow her to bring delicacies to Union prisoners of war there as an act of Christian charity. Well, of course, what else would any patriotic, refined Southern lady do? The warden gave us permission right after she finished complimenting him on his regal mane of hair. Now, making sure to visit keep up appearances by visiting Confederate encampments and hospitals as well, Miss Van Loo brought clothing, food, and books to Union prisoners living in cold, unfurnished rooms with scant bedding and vermin-infested food. And she was determined to do more. In Richmond in 1862, the Confederate government decided to impose martial law, which resulted in some very prominent Richmond men being arrested for disloyalty. Some of them were from Miss Van Loo's same social milieu. However, the Confederate government miscalculated. Their influence easily led to their release, and the attention drawn to Unionist sentiment in Richmond resulted in greater collaboration among them, and a Richmond underground was born. Now, working in league with such men as J. Minor Botts and William S. Rowley, Elizabeth participated and assisted in Union men escaping from the newly founded Libby prison in Richmond. Libby and its counterpart, Castle Thunder, which was a prison in an old tobacco warehouse, were notorious for crowded conditions, food scarcity, and inhuman treatment on the part of prison guards. A few desperate men had actually escaped by pretending to be dead. Now, Elizabeth was never allowed to visit Libby prison, but by persuading Confederate surgeons to hospitalize this or that Union soldier, she could then visit him and bring him her healing custard, along with messages and money hidden in a secret chamber in her custard dish. Escapees found food and shelter at the Van Loos. Her niece, Annie, recalls seeing Elizabeth bringing a plate of food up to a man hiding in a secret chamber in her attic. Elizabeth would send then the escapees on their way with instructions and directions on how to get to Union lines. An audacious escape from Libby prison in 1864 was facilitated by underground intelligence and assistance. A group of about 15 Union soldiers began tunneling from the basement of the building underneath an adjacent vacant lot to a tobacco warehouse on the other side. On the morning of February 10th, 1864, when about 109 men turned up missing, the prison authorities launched a search, and only about 50 of them were ever found and recaptured. African Americans' help in Richmond was essential to the underground success. Servants or slaves, even Elizabeth's, were often used to carry messages back and forth to Union generals or other people, in hiding it in their clothes, sewing it into their shoes, or even stuffing them inside hollowed-out eggs. A young woman who lived with the Van Loos, Mary Elizabeth Richards, was said to have infiltrated the Jefferson Davis White House as a servant, gathering intelligence. While no concrete evidence exists of this activity, Mary Elizabeth certainly was an active participant in the Richmond Underground. African Americans made effective and motivated spies for the Union, especially in border states and along military lines. Their perceived subservience enabled them to observe and gather intelligence without arousing too much suspicion in the minds of their enslavers or the military. A free black woman, Mary Luvestra, informed our Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Wells, personally when the Confederates finished their work on the ironclad ship, the Virginia. And a black man named Dabney, who was working for the Union Army in Fredericksburg in 1863, received coded messages from his wife, underground behind rebel lines, signaled in patterns in hanging laundry out to dry. Now, Elizabeth continued to funnel information to the Union Army for the entire war. Both Union Generals Butler and Grant noted the importance of her information. Despite the wide range of her activities, she was never openly accused or arrested. She didn't consider herself a spy in particular, but as a person working in moral opposition to oppression and treason. Having spent several months working as a volunteer in my own fight against oppression and treason, I decided to enroll in the Hygiotherapeutic College in New York City for further study. Its program focused on what some called eclectic therapies, derided by our conventional physicians. But it was not an idle whim on my part. My experience in the Indiana hospital had convinced me that many of the accepted treatments and medications for sick and wounded soldiers were harsh and unnecessary. In particular, the all too frequent use of amputation to treat a wounded limb. Now the mini ball, the source of those most wounds, did indeed do a great deal of damage to bone and tissue. But in my opinion, doctors were far too anxious to amputate, saying it would save lives. So many young men in their prime, asking me, "Is it really necessary, doctor?" So often I could see that it was not, and I told them so. But rather than confront the surgeons myself, I told them to refuse the amputation and then threaten to come back and haunt the doctor if he did. Well, I graduated the 3-month term with credentials in hydropathy, or the water cure. It's not what you may think. Instead of using opium, morphine, and mercury as first choice, hydropaths advocate drinking plenty of water, soaking in steam baths, healthy meals with plenty of fresh fruits and vegetables, and minute amounts of herbal medicines. We are not patent medicine quacks, just an alternative to conventional medicine. The medical community scorns us, but at least our treatment isn't so difficult to endure. Well, I still was unable to obtain an appointment in any hospital, so I decided to go directly to the front. Stories had been circulating about the shocking lack of prompt and effective battlefield care and relief, and some, such as Miss Clara Barton, had put propriety aside and had gone right there to meet the need. I went to Warrenton, Virginia, where General Burnside had just been given command of the Army of the Potomac. He was preparing to move his soldiers toward Richmond, but had a large number of them sick with typhoid fever that he had to leave behind. He asked for my help. The sick men were lying on the floor in an old house. The only supplies available to me was a bucket of water and a cup. The only basin I could find belonged to a local woman that I gave a silver $1 to for it. Now, having nothing even to wipe the patients' faces, I took my white nightdress and ripped it into pieces and gave it to the orderly, saying, wash the men's faces and hands. Some people later were scandalized that I dare expose a female undergarment in such a way. A nightgown. This is war, for heaven's sakes. Now, General Burnside had authorized me to act as the men's physician and accompany them on their train ride back to Washington to be put in the hospital. I did that and then returned to serve the general in Fredericksburg, where the Union Army had just suffered a devastating defeat. Casualties numbered over 12,000. No one had any time to dither over my qualifications or what I wore. I was told by the managing surgeon to take any cases I chose and dress them preparatory to sending them to Washington. As I watched the stretcher bearers carrying the men to the ambulances and the boats, I told them to carry the men feet first rather than head first, as it would be much more comfortable for the patient. And as I had done before, I followed them on the train up to Washington and saw them put in hospitals. Well, not knowing what to do next, and needing to earn some money, I opened up a private practice in Washington, D.C. in the winter of 1863. One morning, as I walked past the Treasury building, I learned of a young soldier's wife, pregnant with their first child, who had collapsed in the street while searching for her husband. He had been in a major battle, and having not heard from him since, she feared the worst. Now, as a young woman, traveling alone in a strange city without an escort, no decent hotel would give her a room. This was not an isolated case. Another reputable lady had spent a night underneath an evergreen tree in front of the president's house for that same reason. Well, clearly something needed to be done. These women, desperate to find their husbands alive or dead, and if alive, to help them, needed help as they walked through a strange city, searching through numerous hospitals and vast numbers of patients. With help from the Oddfellows and the Union League, and with supplies from the Quartermaster's Department, we opened up a woman's home or a woman's shelter in a rented building across the street from Ford's Theater. I left the administration of the home to the capable hands of local ladies, and then set out once more to try to get a commission as an Army surgeon. Now, fighting had been intense but successful in the West, and by the fall of 1863, much of the Mississippi River was back under Union control. But casualties had been frightful, with over 7,000 in the Battle of Chickamauga alone. Now, the Assistant Surgeon General, R.C. Wood, had actually made a recommendation that I be given a commission out west, but the surgeons there would have none of it. I appealed directly to Secretary of War Stanton and President Lincoln, and that came to nothing. But finally, Congressman John Farnsworth of Illinois interceded for me, and I was given the privilege to appear before the medical board to prove my qualifications. Well, of course, it turned out to be a sham, as the surgeon in charge had no use for a woman doctor. But Colonel Dan McCook of the 52nd Ohio needed an assistant surgeon badly, and ignoring the board's judgment of me as unqualified, appointed me as a contract surgeon for his unit in March 1864. A contract surgeon was basically a civilian doctor who was working for the Army or the military. Now, it was not a commission, and no rank would be given to me, but at least I would be paid. Imagine. The colonel even asked me to put on my green medical sash and review the troops in his absence on one occasion. As far as I know, I'm the only woman to have ever done so. Now, General U.S. Grant, who had been out west, had been given command of the Army of the Potomac, leaving General William Sherman to carry out the campaign in the West of driving the Army deep into the heartland of the South. Following them, her boys, as she had every step of the way from the beginning of the war, was the indomitable Mary Ann Bickerdike. No one ever told Mary Ann Bickerdike what to do. She told them. In fact, even General Sherman told a complaining surgeon, "I can't do a thing. She ranks me." The men called her Mother Bickerdike, and she would stop at nothing to see to it that they were cared for the way she felt they should be. Mary Ann Bickerdike was a widow living in Galesburg, Illinois in 1861, supporting her two young sons with her practice as a botanical healer. Early in the war, her church received an appeal for help for Illinois men serving in Cairo, Illinois. The men had not seen any action yet, but were already dying in great numbers from typhoid fever, dysentery, and pneumonia. And the townspeople knew that Mary Ann was the one to be trusted with bringing supplies and relief. Civil War armies, as she noticed, being primarily volunteer armies, relied heavily on civilian donations of money and supplies, especially early in the war. State militia units were responsible for outfitting their soldiers with everything: arms, ammunition, uniforms, tents, shoes, knapsacks. It's a Herculean task. It's hard to overestimate the importance of women's contributions of homemade clothing, shoes, and preserved foods, as well as bandages. Contractor-made uniforms were made often out of cheap fabric, described as alleged cloth, pounded, rolled, glued, and smoothed to look like cloth. Well, they fell apart almost immediately and added a new word to our vocabulary: shoddy. Now, as in Mary Ann's hometown of Galesburg, women north and south organized their sewing circles to sew and make uniforms and shirts, underwear and handkerchiefs, knit socks, roll bandages, and scrape lint to provide for the need for the soldiers. And in the north, a civilian organization, the Sanitary Commission, was established by the Lincoln administration to collect these supplies and money, and also to inspect military camps for cleanliness. Now, a proper hospital was quickly set up under Mary Ann's direction in Cairo, and Sanitary Commission supplies were sent. Now, Mary Ann, never being overawed by men in authority in the first place, suspected that some of the doctors and officers were helping themselves to the wine, whiskey, and food that had been sent for the patients. So some stewed peaches, which she prepared for the boys, confirmed her suspicions when a little later she went into the kitchen to find a group of officers and doctors cramping and retching, notifying them that they'd been caught red-handed by the addition of tartar emetic. She warned them, next time it'll be worse. It was not the last time the doctors or officers would have been reprimanded or perhaps even dismissed because of Mary Ann. Now, knowing that she would take what she wanted for the soldiers anyway, the Sanitary Commission hired her as an agent and sent supplies directly to her. She did not abuse her authority, but acted resourcefully, establishing laundries to wash uniforms and linens instead of just discarding them. She traded luxuries such as tea with Southern women for soap. When she got dissatisfied with the quality of eggs and milk that she was buying from Southern farm wives, she personally traveled to Illinois and southern Wisconsin and returned to camp with 100 donated cows and 1,000 donated chickens, bringing them back over corduroy roads, through swamps, and over temporary bridges. On one occasion, an officer had the temerity to ask her under whose authority she was acting. She said, "I have received my authority from the Lord God Almighty. Have you got anything that ranks higher than that?" Well, Mary Ann stayed with General Sherman on the campaign right through till he got to Atlanta. And the men loved her. As one man wrote home, he said, "She talks bad grammar and jaws at us all and isn't afraid of anybody. But Lord, how she works." Well, my assignment in the West placed me in the middle of a war zone, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Much of the significant fighting had moved on, leaving the area residents suffering from disease and privation with practically no resources of any kind. Now, there being less need for my services among the soldiers, Colonel McCook gave me permission to go into the countryside and help relieve some of the sufferings of the local inhabitants, primarily women and young children. So I went there and I pulled teeth, delivered babies, lanced boils, and prescribed medications. And if you want to take a look later at some of our medications, you can do that. Here is potassium iodide. Now, in their hour of need, one woman refused to believe that I wasn't a man until I let down my long hair and allowed her to pull on it to prove that it wasn't false. Now, these women had been left in the area with practically no men, and of course, no doctors. All had been conscripted into the Confederate Army, even though people living in this mountainous area generally didn't have slaves or weren't that interested in secession. Some of these women were hiding husbands, brothers, sons, fathers from the draft. As they told me, they felt that they had been left behind to root hog or die, and lived in constant fear every day of losing what little bit they did have. Now, I was never officially asked to be a spy for the Union. However, if I was passing through territory and I obtained some pertinent information, I certainly passed it along. Now, that's all I will say about spying. However, unfortunately, on April 10th, 1864, as I was traveling to visit patients, I was captured by Confederate sentries and then turned over to Confederate General D.H. Hill. And a week later, I was on a train for Richmond to be imprisoned in the notorious Castle Thunder. I was by no means the only female prisoner there. Among them was Loretta Velasquez, or Mary Jane Williams, or Mary Keith. She had so many aliases, it was hard to know exactly who she was. Now, this dubious character, skilled at self-invention, claimed to have raised Confederate regiments on her own out west and to have fought on the battlefield at Fort Donelson and Shiloh. Well, she may have served in battle. She probably did spy for the Confederacy, but one thing that was certain is that she was a fraud of immense proportions. She was finally arrested by the Confederates for impersonating a Confederate officer and thrown in jail. Conservative estimates put the number of women who donned male attire, even to the point of fake facial hair, who donned male attire on either side of the conflict and fought in the Army. I think there were probably about 400 women who did so. Now, knowing that there was a good reason for these people to keep their secret, and that many people who died on the battlefield were hastily buried in an unmarked grave, that number could be higher than 400. Here's Sarah Emma Edmonds, who was originally born in Canada. She enlisted under the name Frank Thompson, took male identity, and enlisted in the 2nd Michigan Infantry. She was on the field at the first Battle Bull Run. Her service record also included 2nd Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg, where she helped care for wounded soldiers. At Antietam, she attended another soldier who was also a woman in disguise. Her assignment as a letter carrier led her naturally into spying activities. In her memoirs, she describes disguising herself as a black man named Cuff, an Irish peddler named Bridget, and a black laundress to collect information. Leaving the Army after an injury to avoid detection, she went home, married, had a family, and kept her secret until 1883. Another Union soldier, Private Albert Cashier, kept her secret even longer. 17-year-old Jenny Hodgers enlisted in the 98th Illinois Infantry on August 2nd, 1862, and served a full 3-year enlistment. She was on the field during the siege of Vicksburg, where she escaped capture in a one-on-one fight with her Confederate opponent. Part of the Army of the Tennessee, she was also engaged in fierce battles in Franklin and Nashville, and then her unit was transferred to serve in the Red River Campaign in Louisiana under General Nathaniel Banks. After her discharge, when the war was over, she went back home and continued life as a man, working as a handyman and a laborer. Her secret was not discovered until 1911, when an injury landed her in the hospital. Another young woman, Sarah Rosetta Wakeman from Afton, New York, which is near Binghamton, she donned male attire and took the name Lyons Wakeman and enlisted in the New York 153rd Volunteers. Now, her unit was first stationed in Washington, D.C. as a military guard, but then was later transferred into that Red River Campaign in Louisiana for more active duty. Sadly, Sarah Rosetta contracted chronic diarrhea from the unhealthy living conditions in the swamps down there and died before she could get adequate medical care. She wrote numerous letters home to her family here in New York, who kept those letters, and they kept her secret for years. I know some of you are thinking, how do you keep a secret like that? Living with men in close proximity, intense, and what about day-to-day things? Well, any of you that have been camping probably understand very well about sleeping in your clothes, less frequent bathing, answering the call of nature in nature, etc., etc., etc. It should also be remembered that there were many beardless boys of smaller stature and higher voices in the ranks. Perhaps the most important thing to remember is that in my era, gender identification is often more closely connected with attire than actual physical characteristics. A person in pants must be a man. But there were those within the ranks that did know, of course, and kept the secret. In fact, pregnant enlisted men were not unheard of. General Rosecrans, a Union general, upon hearing that a soldier in his unit had given birth, raged, "It's against all military law and army regulations. Such a case has not been known since the days of Jupiter," and he recommended swift punishment. Some of you might also be saying, why? Why leave the safety of home and family to go to war? Well, here's Frances Hook, who enlisted with her brother as Frank Miller in the Union Army. They were orphans and had no one but each other, so they would not be separated. And I do believe both of them ended up being killed in the war. Now, husbands and wives were known to have served together. This is Susie King Taylor, who served with her husband in the 33rd U.S. Colored Troops in Beaufort, South Carolina. Now, Susie King had been born into slavery in Georgia, but fortunately for her, she had been allowed to live with her grandmother in Savannah, who saw to it that Susie was educated in secret. In the spring of 1862, when Union and Confederate gunboats were battling off the coast of South Carolina, Susie and her family escaped on a Union ship to St. Simon's Island. The captain of the ship, upon hearing that Susie could read and write, asked her to hold classes for the refugee children. So at the age of 13, Susie opened the first free school for black children in Georgia and became the first black teacher in Georgia. She taught about 30 to 40 youngsters by day and a number of men and women at night, all very anxious to learn. Now, in August of that same year, the able-bodied men in the area were mustered into the U.S. 33rd Colored Troops. And not long after that, Susie married Edward King. They served together in the unit until their discharge in 1866. Now, although Susie is listed as a laundress, she spent most of her time packing ammunition and supplies as well as learning to become a crack shot. Unfortunately, her husband died shortly after the war, and Susie found it difficult to provide for her baby son. She tried teaching, but often had to accept work as a domestic. And a trip with her employers to Boston resulted in her returning there later on, marrying again, and starting a new life. Now, some young women found the allure of going to war and glory and the excitement of freedom of life as a man an opportunity not to be missed. The actress, Pauline Cushman here, briefly served a period as a Union double agent in the West, and then vivandières, or color bearers as they were called, like Katie Brownell from Rhode Island, found military life appealing for a while. The impetuous and brash Belle Boyd of West Virginia thrived on the notoriety of spying for the Confederacy and passing messages to Stonewall Jackson. And she killed a young Union soldier in her parlor because he had the audacity to insult her mother. Now, the upstanding ladies and Nancy Hill Morgan of LaGrange, Georgia, they were going to leave home to enlist. They planned on defending their community themselves. They formed an all-female regiment called the Nancy Hearts, named after a Revolutionary War heroine who successfully defended her home against Tory intruders. They used the manual Hardy's light infantry and rifle tactics and drilled twice a week for the duration of the war. When the Union Army invaded nearby West Point, Virginia, the Nancy Hearts mustered and met the enemy troops. And they stood their ground until Union General LaGrange, who was no relation, assured them that private property would be spared. Now, women on both sides of the conflict found themselves behind plows, behind shop counters, as teachers, and working in factories. Some of these women were able to take their feminine skills, such as sewing, and turn them into employment, while others had to seek employment outside the woman's sphere. Now, while upper and middle class ladies could gravitate towards more genteel occupations of teaching or government clerkships, working class women often had to find employment in factories. Working in the arsenals was a hazardous job. An explosion in a Washington, D.C. arsenal resulted in 19 women being killed. And a similar accident in Jackson, Mississippi took the lives of 15. And seamstresses, making uniforms, shirts, shoes, saddlebags, tents for the Army, were paid shockingly low wages. Some of them retaliated by forming their own sewing collectives to work for government contracts, as they did in Detroit, Michigan. Some seamstresses in Providence, Rhode Island, and Richmond, Virginia, went on strike. Their efforts usually came to naught, but women were becoming much more comfortable in publicly asserting and advocating for their rights. Women participated in draft riots, North and South, and Richmond faced down a horde of angry women in 1863 in bread riots. Well, finding myself as a prisoner of war was as severe an infringement upon my rights as I'd ever experienced. I was continually harassed and lectured about my inappropriate dress until finally I broke down into tears under the stress. And prison life was unbearable. Vermin crawled among the bedclothes, rats scurried across the floor, and the food was foul. And prisoners were often found that there was death at the hands of prison guards. I was a prisoner of war for 4 months, after which I was returned and exchanged for a Confederate surgeon. I had lost a great deal of weight and suffered from vision problems which would haunt me for the rest of my life. But still wanting to serve my country and needing to get some employment, I asked General Sherman to intercede for me to obtain the position of medical surgeon for a women's military prison in Louisville, Kentucky. That was a difficult assignment. The inmates were generally Confederate thieves, spies, or women jailed for disloyalty. I imposed disciplinary measures to get them to clean up their talk and their bodies, but they were defiant. And also frustrating was the continual interference and oppression on the part of male authorities in the facility. But Confederacy was failing after 4 long years. Finally, General Lee surrendered, and the work to putting our country and our lives back together could begin. Well, the South had suffered destruction on a level that would take them years to recover from. And although slavery was dead and the wealth of the planter class was lost, the freed people would still be subjected to a great deal of economic and political control on parts of their former enslavers. Certainly women's lives would never be the same. Most of them didn't go back to the sheltered existence they had before, and for many, it wasn't even an option. For some places that were keeping track, even before the war was over, a place like Illinois reported 2,000 refugees from the South each month coming to the state, primarily women with young children. It was estimated there were about 25,000 people living in New York City and at least 80,000 such refugees in the area of Washington, D.C. Well, the Homestead Act, with its offer of land in the West, beckoned for those who were willing to start over. Mary Ann Bickerdike, still the cyclone in calico, always willing to help, persuaded General Sherman to condemn a large number of army wagons for use by the homesteaders, and to have him get the railroad company to build a hotel in Kansas, which she would administer. It became known as Bickerdike House because Mary Ann couldn't bring herself to charge veterans and their families. When Kansas had a grasshopper plague, Mary Ann went and got supplies from the Sanitary Commission. Her sons sent her to San Francisco for a rest, so she passed the time out there acting as a pension agent for veterans. She later returned to New York City, where she worked to rehabilitate alcoholics, and she joined the Women's Relief Corps, which was the auxiliary of the Grand Army of the Republic Veterans Organization for Union soldiers. Here's a pin for that. She finally accepted a pension from the government of $300 a month in 1886. It was only half of what they had wanted to give her. That's all she would accept. Now, although she had more than earned it, Harriet Tubman wasn't going to slow down either. She, after the war was over, returned to her home in Auburn in western New York, and she married Nelson Charles Davis, who was 22 years younger than she. Go Harriet. They adopted a daughter, an acquaintance that they knew, a family member, and they settled down to family life in Auburn. She brought many of her family members there. She became quite a speaker and activist for women's suffrage, giving lectures in Boston, New York City, and Washington, D.C. After having cared for her elderly relatives for years, she bought property adjacent to her home to establish a home for indigent and elderly colored people. Working in conjunction with the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, it finally opened its doors in 1908. And Harriet spent her final years as a resident in the home she helped create. Susie King Taylor was an active Women's Relief Corps member too. Through the organization, she helped veterans of color obtain pensions, educational and social support. She also wrote her memoirs, as did Sarah Emma Edmonds, Kate Cumming, Phoebe Yates Pember, and the infamous Loretta Velasquez. Now, before the war, very few women would ever broach propriety by writing and publishing, especially under their own names. People like Lydia Maria Child and Catherine Beecher got away with it because they were writing books on feminine subjects like household management and education for women. One exception was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who made a nationwide and eventually worldwide sensation with her 1850 book, anti-slavery book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was subtitled Life Among the Lowly. Well, it became a great commercial success, and in her era sold over 300,000 copies and was made into a play as well. And President Lincoln, as you probably heard, when he met her, said to her, "So you're the little lady that started this great war." Julia Ward Howe had been writing poetry and publishing literary criticism for years, in spite of her famous husband, Samuel Cridley Howe's, objections. During the war, she was asked to write new lyrics for the popular song, John Brown's Body. She penned the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which became the North's favorite patriotic song. And Louisa May Alcott, who's the daughter of Bronson Alcott, who's a noted reformer and educator, served a brief period in a Washington, D.C. hospital as a nurse before she was sent home sick with typhoid fever. In 1863, she published her first book, Hospital Sketches, based on her experience in the hospital, and she received $40 for the manuscript. Well, it became a critical and literary success and launched her career, and as you probably know, she became a successful novelist, and her book, Little Women, has become a literary classic. Now, there were some Southern women who wrote their post-war diaries or their memoirs, Mary Boykin Chestnut from South Carolina being one of the best known. There were also people like Kate Stone and Sarah Morgan Dawson from Louisiana, and Lucy Rebecca Buck from Virginia. But times have changed. More women had the ability to go to college. Over 300 institutions opened their doors to women for the first time in the years between 1865 and 1900. So consequently, more entered the professions, and soon a woman doctor, such as myself, was no longer such an oddity. Well, as for myself, well, my experience and work in the war severely disabled my health and made it difficult for me to carry on full-time as a physician. There was still plenty for me to do. For all my wartime service, I received a total of $766.16 from the government. Having been given no commission or rank, I was not eligible for a military pension. I was awarded an allotment of 50% for disability, $8.50 a month. It was raised to $20 in 1899. President Andrew Johnson, realizing that some acknowledgement of my military service was in order, especially since I told him so, well, he conferred the Medal of Honor upon me in November 1865. It's my proudest achievement, and I wear it conspicuously every day of my life. I cleared up one other inconvenient issue in my life in 1869, my divorce. Oh yes, I had met Albert Miller as a medical student in Syracuse, and shortly after our marriage, I discovered he'd been unfaithful, and I informed him of my intention to seek a divorce. Well, he suggested we stay together, and that I could take the same privileges for myself that he had taken for himself. Vile suggestion. The original divorce decree granted him the divorce against me. I had it changed in New York State to reflect his culpability. But my days are busy now. I spend a great deal of time on the lecture circuit talking about health care, dress reform, my Civil War service, and of course, women's suffrage. It has taken me all over the country and to England and France. I have good friends with Susan B. Anthony, Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucy Stone. Belva Lockwood, another good friend of mine, has become one of the first female lawyers in the country. Another pioneer, just like me. Oh, I'm well aware that many people still find me, my opinions, and especially my clothing, as insupportable. Well, I won't apologize for being opinionated, and feel free to express myself clearly whenever I feel it appropriate. I have been arrested for wearing men's clothes more times than I can count. And yet, even positive change can be uncomfortable. And I know we have a long way to go. But as the venerable heroine of the Civil War, Clara Barton, has stated, woman is at least 50 years in advance of the normal position that continued peace would have assigned her. We may harbor regrets, but certainly not our newfound freedom. As a postscript, Dr. Walker was the only woman, and still is the only woman, to ever have received the Medal of Honor from the government. She never received recognition as an Army surgeon or a veteran's pension. In 1917, the Medal of Honor Board decided to relinquish her medal, saying that her service had not been in actual combat, by gallantry, through intrepidity, at risk of life, for service above and beyond the call of duty. She was ordered to return her medal. Of course, she refused and continued to put it on every single day of her life. In 1976, a woman, Miss Mary Hay Wilson, proved through documentation that she was a great niece of Dr. Walker through one of Dr. Walker's sisters, and appealed that the medal be restored to her. And in 1977, the Medal of Honor Board did restore Dr. Mary's Medal of Honor to her, saying that while only her service as a contract surgeon could be considered, that she had acted with gallantry for service above and beyond the call of duty. Thank you so much for listening.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Everyone, we have all kinds of refreshments and goodies back here. Please don't leave. You must help us eat it. Are there any questions?
Or I'm happy to talk with people afterwards too. And I have my medical kit up here, my medications, and some other, if you want to check them out, I'm happy to talk with you. But if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, yes. Well, let's see. They have